Politicians and the press often toss around comparisons to Winston Churchill, but this time, minus the cigar and the whiskey, it fits.
Face to face with the man who has drawn comparisons to Winston Churchill.
This was historic. Some people have compared it to when Churchill came.
Zelensky is very much acting in the Churchillian tradition.
What could be a Churchillian moment?
I mean, he is a modern Winston Churchill with an iPhone.
Someone who probably is the most courageous and inspirational leader since Winston Churchill.
Where Winston Churchill stood generations ago, so too President Zelensky stands.
So you're almost saying that Zelensky's got a harder job than Churchill had.
This guy actually can be compared to Winston Churchill, to Lincoln in 1860.
So idolatry is an inversion of a holy hierarchy. So I've shown this image before where you have things in their proper space, in their proper place, prioritized in the proper way, and things done orderly, basically. And what you can have is a false hierarchy, right? And so the false hierarchy is an inversion, a reprioritization of the false over the good. And so, to me, whenever you do that, there's an idolatry that's associated with it because you're taking something false and treating it as if it's important or true. And so, I want to make 2 points regarding this sort of conceptualization of idolatry. And the first is that idolatry, therefore, is very generally a deception. Okay, we will look at multiple examples to elucidate how the deceptive aspect of idolatry operates and its consequences. Right, to deceive is to make something false seem true or true seem false, and so naturally that also captures the essence of idolatry is the falseness of the god. And the falseness of the idol. So the result overall is an inversion, a misplacement of a true order, leaving only a false hierarchy. The bad seen as good is actually the kind of standard way we think about idolatry, but even seeing the good as bad, that is also an idolatry because it's still an inversion of what is true, what is good, what is right, what is holy. So this inversion is reflective of a false pursuit due to deception and delusional thinking. So there's delusion, there's illusion in deception in the concept of idolatry. That's the first main point. And so the hero ultimately sees the truth of the idolatry and desecrates the false image or the illusion, shatters that illusion, and thus reconsecrates what is holy. So that's the first thing. The second point I want to make is that idolatry is very general, or at least how I'm using it is in the very general sense to encompass all sin. Any and all sin, the root is an idolatry of some kind. So to me, it's the first and second of the Decalogue for a reason, where it's like, thou shalt not put any God before me, thou shalt not make any false idols, that sort of thing. Those are the first statements, because that is kind of the point. To me, everything else is kind of an elaboration of that very basic and primary point, which is all sin at its root is idolatrous in some way, right? So we can always capture sin in blaspheming and desecrating and in the negative sense, an idolatry in some way. So I've seen some criticism regarding making that abstraction, but I do think it is useful because it gets at the heart of what sin is, where, placing something before good, what is holy, what is true, what is right, what the Judeo-Christian religions or faiths would consider to be in alignment with God's will, right? So to me, it simplifies things, but not too much, because all it really means is that all thought, speech, and action is measured with respect to the good or God's will, what is true, what is holy. To emphasize any sin as idolatry is to characterize or personify the desires within our own heart, such that when we succumb to gluttony, greed, lust, wrath, sloth, envy, pride, and all these sins, right, we are ultimately bowing down to the animalistic bull reptilian brain or deity within our own selves. When we succumb to such sin, we are prioritizing, elevating the tyrannical, devilish force that compels us to act in such impulsive ways. When we succumb to that sin, we succumb to the idolatry, allowing that reptilian brain or bull deity to sit within the center of our own heart, guiding our thoughts, speech, and action, overwhelming our higher self, losing the inner battle. We thus bow down to its influence and deception. This is why I view idleness as deeply connected with idolatry, as it is through idleness we are inactive, giving up the divine work of taming the inner animal in all its sinful and profane proclivities. So the main idea here is everything is being in reference to what is right and pure and proper. That's why anything else is idleness or idolatry, because everything is being measured with respect to this sort of ineffable, ultimately good thing. Like we try to attach all these labels to it, but in reality, it's something that is transcendent, something that is, we can sort of conceptualize it as love or compassion or, the right thing. But, what is the right thing? And so it's always a measure. Something is being measured with respect to something internal.
He'll break through the unity's defenses.
Remind me, how's that again?
With the power of love.
Right. So think of the mythology of the werewolf, for instance, that comes out on a full moon, right? The moon being associated with the unconscious elements of our own psyche. It's a natural thing to personify these sort of vicious and vile desires. And so whenever we succumb to them, we are bowing down to that personified desire. So there is a part of each individual that, if left untamed or unrestrained, will take us toward the broad path that leads to destruction. Okay? And so that's the idea. To better elucidate this idea, this general conception of idolatry, I want to look at one particular example, one particular parallel in Zack Snyder's Justice League. In particular, we note the visual comparison between Steppenwolf reaching for the mother box and the truck driver reaching for the burger. Okay, so we have Steppenwolf reaching for the mother box. We have the man in the truck reaching for the burger. Note that they are both represented as sort of a bull deity, the calf in some sense, the animalistic is being conveyed here, the monstrous. We have the horns of the truck, right? The truck itself is this metallic exterior, and we see Steppenwolf wearing the metallic shell, right? Sort of concealing or protecting what is within, which is really just a person or being that is sort of consumed by this sense of idolatry, where we can ask, why is Steppenwolf reaching for that mother box, right? We could say that Steppenwolf is greedy for power, but more precisely, it is idolatry of Darkseid that compels and guides all his actions throughout the movie, right? So he wants to get in a better way with Darkseid. He idolatrizes Darkseid, and all of his sins are actually resulting from that idolatry. His greed or lust for power, his wrath, his pride, perhaps even envy of Desad sitting at the side of Darkseid, right? All stem from this infatuation or worship of Darkseid, his false idol. And so his whole point is to appease a false god. And so when he's reaching for this, really at the heart of it is appeasement of a false idol. And so what stands as the physical manifestation of the false idol here is the mother box itself, right? So the mother box itself, it's like that's the thing that he's putting at the center of meaning and purpose for all his actions, right? Extended to his idolatry of dark side. So you could ask, what is the false god for the truck driver, right? What is the truck driver trying to appease? Who is the truck driver trying to appease? It is his own animalistic desire personified, his impulse for food, gluttony, greed, lust for the burger. The burger and the mother box, so too, become an expression of the false idol, ultimately replacing a humble moral compass that would actually be mindful of what's happening around them and what is sacred around them. The truck driver is not paying attention to the road. There are people in the street. There are other cars. There's all these other things that the truck driver should clearly be mindful of, but he's putting something before that. In fact, he's putting something profane before that. A dirty, disgusting hamburger on the ground. A cheeseburger on the ground is nasty. It's vile. Okay? Well beyond the 3-second rule. Okay? We're beyond that. It's disgusting. He should give up on this thing, but he is compelled. He is compelled through his idolatry, which we would call an idol of the heart. He's putting that at the center of his, as if that's going to give him salvation. That's the center of his operating in the world, is this burger, right? It's a profane thing. It's a material thing. It's an alluring thing. It's something that's compelled by biological impulse that he has. In this moment, he's not taming, not controlling. The mother box is the same thing. It's a hamburger. It's a false idol. It's a profane stand-in for what is true salvation. It is a false idol, and so they become idols of the heart. These things that we reach for that aren't actually going to save us, we treat as if they will save us. We treat them as if they're the holy thing that will, bring us peace of mind, right, and spiritual salvation. But they're not. They're MacGuffins. They're superficial stand-ins for the holy thing. Okay, and so what they're trying to do is this sort of satisfying the lust of the flesh and the pride of life. But actually, that is a spiritual red herring, a distraction from the true God, the true good, true peace, the truly holy that leads to everlasting life. Okay? And this is the idea. And so whenever we do that, in any case, these are very different situations, right? One's food, one's a mother box that can destroy the planet. But why are they being portrayed in the same way, right? It's not enough to see a parallel. We must extrapolate why that parallel exists. Why is there a parallel? To stop at, hey, these look the same, that's not enough. We must understand what the parallel is saying, right? You don't just put parallels for no reason. If you treat it as parallels for no reason, you're idling. It becomes an idolatry in and of itself. So we actually have to find what the message is, or what the point is, or what the juxtaposition is saying. Given that the burger and the mother box are very different things physically, we have to abstract to as far as we need to abstract to understand what the parallel is saying. And clearly, to me, it's saying that there are these animalistic drives, right? They're both kind of bulls, right? They're both got the horns. It's a devilish, satanic thing when one cannot tame their profane proclivities, right? And so in the process, what's the natural order that they should be paying attention to? Or at least the truck driver in this case. The truck driver should be paying attention to the rules of the road, should be moving slower, should be attentive, careful of his surroundings. For, if he isn't, then there's the possibility of destruction of sacred things. And that's precisely what happens, right? So by not being careful, by not paying attention to the rules of the road, man seeking things that are profane, but treating them as if they are his salvation, that they will result in his salvation, results in destruction. That's going to be a major theme. And the other thing is that Iris West also, right? There's an idolatry in both cases. So there's an idolatry of the burger. There's an idolatry of Iris West being distracted by the Flash, right? Barry Allen, right? So she's not paying attention either. And even though the natural order says she should be allowed to go and he needs to stop, there's an idolatry there anyway, because she's not paying due diligence to the fact that some people aren't following the rules of the road, right? So there's a responsibility on Iris West to not sort of kind of blithely accept whether she should go or not, right? But to tread carefully in the idea that other people are not going to be following the rules. This is a big thing. And so there's an idolatry of breaking the rules in the first place, and there's an idolatry of people assuming that other people are playing by the rules. Okay? And that leads to destruction. Okay, so that's the main idea. So the idols of the heart is very general. It's not one particular sin. It's all sin. You place it something before what is proper, what is true. That's an idol of the heart. We, ideally, God's will would have us do away with that and continue the holy work of being careful, treating things in their proper way, being mindful, being attentive. All of these things are part of the holy work. Okay, so we see here in the imagery of the idolatrous golden calf, the Israelites became idle with respect to the divine work while waiting for Moses to return from Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights, right? So that's a long time to idle, and in that idleness, this is what happens. We see here both an active and passive idolatry, right? So there are those on their knees, actively worshiping, giving direct attention and submission to the false idol. Juxtaposed to a passive idolatry on the left. Those on their feet, not paying attention, dancing as an idle pastime, whereby through one's carelessness, laziness, and thoughtlessness, ultimately accept a false idol as well. It is precisely that idleness that allows for the construction and self-satisfied embrace of the idolatrous image. So, if we can look back at the burger and Iris West looking at Barry Allen, both are engaged in an idolatry. That idolatry is a distraction from what is proper. Okay, so they should be doing something else, but they've put something else before the good. They've put something else before God's will, which is to have us do the holy work, to be careful, to be humble, and to proceed cautiously, to do the right thing, basically, right? So again, it is precisely that idleness that allows for the construction and self-satisfied embrace of the idolatrous image, a dangerous deception of the devil, right? So the deception is, this is more important. This is the key to my salvation. If only I had this, then everything would be okay. That is false thinking. That is idolatry of anything that compels you to think such a thing. So in our idleness, we are easily deceived to believe in the false idol, right? So idolatry is an idleness because it's like we're being careless, we're being thoughtless, we're not doing the holy work. Everything is measured against the holy work. Everything is measured against the good. Everything is measured against God's will. That's why all of these things are actually the same thing. Easily convinced that the good is in the golden calf, right? So that's the deception. In our complacency, we thoughtlessly proceed and invite a destructive mischief, for as we know, idle hands are the devil's workshop. More generally, when we lack due diligence and vigilance with respect to the divine work of proper discernment, between the true and the false, the pure and impure, the right and the wrong, the good and evil. We invite into our holy temples, our holy spaces, our hearts and minds, the devil or demons of our own destruction. Okay, the Garden of Eden is even one such biblical account of this same idea. In their idleness, the snake, Satan, easily deceived them into eating the alluring forbidden fruit. They put the snake's words above God's command. The forbidden fruit is here the false idol, the alluring forbidden fruit, right? It's typically portrayed as like a red apple. It's gold and red. These colors are alluring. They grab our attention, and so therefore they are false idols typically, right? It's the material allure, much like a moth to a flame, right? But that moth gets killed once it gets too close to the light, yeah? And so this is the idea. The forbidden fruit, the false idol, the false god, the golden calf, represents the allure of the flesh and the pride of life that they ate, right? In the forbidden fruit case, they actually ate in contradiction to God's divine will. So they did something, they put something before what is good, what is proper, right? It's not the apple that was the problem. It's not football, that's the problem. It's not dancing, that's the problem. It's not singing, that's the problem. It's not enjoying life. It's not enjoying the pleasures of life, that is the problem. The problem is when those pleasures are put before the will of the good, the will of God, the right thing. That's when it becomes a problem. And so it's like, why is an apple the result of their destruction? It's not the apple. It's the fact that God said, don't do this. And then you put your own desires ahead of that. That is what's wrong. Okay, so you can eat. There are other apples they could have eaten. It's not an apple. You can watch football. You can play games. You can relax, right? Even God had a day of rest, right? So rest and relaxation and enjoyment of pleasures is not the problem. It's when we let the pleasures. This is the more precise thing. This is the more important thing. It's when we let those pleasures get in the way of what's good. Okay, and this is the illusion that those pleasures are at the top of the hierarchy, and the only thing that matters is the pleasures, when actually there's something that matters more. The holy work, the good work, wherein one need look within their own humble heart of hearts, awakening, unlocking, and accessing the kingdom of heaven within. Okay, so this is the idea. Idleness, idolatry, desecration, and now today we're kind of bringing in the mix of all of that, deception. Right, and what better story to kind of discuss all of those things than the Trojan horse myth? And it really has all of the elements, and so everyone's pretty much familiar with the Trojan horse. And so I don't want to just reiterate the story. I want to actually explain these specific themes, how they show up, how these specific themes that I'm talking about show up in the story. Right, so there's idleness, and so for me, I'm using it, for better or worse, as a blanket term to cover everything that is a lack of care, right? So indolence, impetuous, even those words, they almost seem like opposite. Impetuous is like you kind of get ahead of yourself and you kind of overact on something. Indolence is like you're like lazy, basically, right, and not active. And so to me, in this sense, they're both being idle because you're not doing what is proper. You know what is proper. You know what is the actual work. Everything else is idle with respect to that. So there's a lack of due diligence, a lack of care, a lack of thought, improper, ignoring obvious signs, not keeping focused, complacency is part of what I'm calling idle. You're just fine with the way things are. You're stagnating in some sense, okay? Whether mentally or physically, right? So in both cases. And so for the first example, we have a sort of over-eagerness and over-optimistic attitude by the Trojans when they initially see that the Greeks had appeared to have left. So it says in the Aeneid, so all Troy breathes free. relieved of her endless sorrow, we fling open the gates and stream out, elated to see Greeks' abandoned camp, the deserted beachhead. So they're kind of jumping the gun, and they're just letting their initial perceptions guide them, right? They're not doing the work of, is what we're perceiving actually reflective of what is true? Okay, and so whenever you do that, that can manifest as overeagerness, that can manifest as this impetuous kind of attitude. You're complacent with what is being presented to you, the surface level kind of appearance of things, right? And that's one of the major themes. We'll get to deception, more examples of that as well. So they're eager to believe a lie, right? This is the kind of blind optimism due to exhaustion of the good and mindful work, the careful. They're like, wait, are we sure about this? No, we just want to skip all that, forget about that work, because that's too much work to entertain all these complex realities that could be presented before us. No, we just want to assume that what we're seeing and take it, at surface level. Okay, so another example is being blind to obvious warnings, right? So not only are they getting overexcited based on superficial perspectives and idling from doing their due diligence, therefore, there's all these warnings that they're not responding to properly, right? So to respond to obvious warnings, that means you're doing the work, thinking about it. What should I do? This is idleness as well. You're not doing what is right. So Laocoon is one of the priests, the Trojan priests, who says this. He says the following in the Aeneid. Poor doomed fools, have you gone mad, you Trojans? You really believe the enemy has sailed away? Or any gift of the Greeks is free of guile? Is that how well you know Ulysses? Trust me, either the Greeks are hiding, shut inside those beams, or the horse is a battle engine geared to breach our walls, spy on our home, come down on our city, overwhelm us, or some other deceptions lurking deep inside, right? Trojans, never trust that horse. He's saying exactly what it is, right? Whatever it is, I fear the Greeks, especially bearing gifts, right? He says he fears Greeks, especially bearing gifts. That's where that phrase comes from. Be wary of Greeks bearing gifts. And in that spirit, with all his might, he hurled a huge spear straight into the monster's flanks, mortise timberwork of its swollen belly. Quivering, there it stuck, and the stricken womb came booming back from its depths with echoing groans. There's signs. He's saying exactly what it is. He throws a spear at it, groans. They hear groans. This is Aeneas saying this. That means he heard the groans. They weren't acting out properly with these signs that were presented to them. So there's echoing groans, right? So Aeneas goes on to say, if fate and our wits had not gone against us, surely Laocoon would have driven us on now to rip the Greek lair open with iron spears, and Troy would still be standing, right? So their wits, it wasn't with them. The fates aren't with them. Their wits, they're not doing due diligence. They're not responding properly to the signs and warnings basically being shown to them. And that's a major theme, by the way. That's a major theme, is that not only is there this deception that we'll talk more about, but there are signs. There are signs that are presented to us. We need to heed those signs, right? And if we don't heed those signs, we're being idle. Hey, there's a warning, do something, and you don't do it, you're being idle, right? Another thing is that's talked about is slumber, right? This language of slumber, being buried deep in sleep and wine and that sort of thing. So it later says, the Trojans slept on, strewn throughout their fortress, weary bodies embraced by slumber. They steal on a city buried deep in sleep and wine. And so this is after they had brought the Trojan horse in. There's this language that they're asleep at the wheel. That's an interesting phrase, because the Trojan horse was wheeled in. So they're asleep at the wheel. They're asleep with this thing inside that they have, we'll talk about as well, treated as sacred. Okay, And so there's all these examples in language being used in the Aeneid, emphasizing this idleness, this slumber, this blind, ignoring of warnings, not doing something when there's all these signs saying, okay, you need to be worried about this. And they don't respond properly for a variety of reasons. And that's part of the deception as well, right? So let's look at some of the deception, right? So the main deception, of course, is that just on its physical level, the horse is physically blocking what is inside, right? So the truth of what is real is being blocked by a superficial layer, right? And so you stop at that superficial layer. You don't dig deep. You accept the horse in its deception, and you ignore the signs pointing to say, hey, there's something deeper here. You need to look and figure it out, but they're idle from doing that, right? The divine work is very much about seeking the truth, right? And so when you stop seeking the truth, you're being idle in that divine work, all right? So that's another way to kind of capture idleness, is that there's signs, there's warnings, there's something they should be doing, and then they stop seeking the truth, okay? And so deception, you have that physical outer layer, and the actual language used in Virgil's Aeneid it's described as masterpiece of fraud. That sounds familiar, right? What do you think that kind of mirrors in BVS? Masterpiece of fraud. What is that? So there's that physicality, first and foremost, and it says, an offering to secure safe passage home, or so they pretend, and the story spread throughout Troy. But they pick by lot the best, most able-bodied men, and stealthily lock them into the horse's dark flanks till the vast hold of the monster's womb is packed with soldiers' bristling weapons. And so this outer layer is hiding all of these soldiers and their weapons. Okay, so that's the physical nature of deception, simply an outer layer blocking the inner layer. Sinon's elaborate lie, right? So he's one of the Greeks. He is the Greek left to help spin the web, right? So first they see the horse. They don't understand, like, what is this? Is it this? Is it that? Is it bad? Is it good? They don't know. So he helps guide them in his deception and his kind of fanciful tale of playing a victim and being on their side and hating the Greeks. They end up, of course, buying into it. And so he spins an elaborate lie. In the Aeneid, it says, now, of course, we burn to question him, urge him to explain, blind to how false the cunning Greeks could be. All a tremble, he carries on with his tale, lying from the cockles of his heart. I love that phrase. That's funny. From the cockles of his heart, okay? He later tells the Trojans to pity a man whose torment knows no bounds. So he's playing victim, and through that victimhood, he gains their pity, right? And so it says, pity me in my pain. I know in my soul I don't deserve to suffer. He wept and won his life, our pity too. So that's Aeneas saying that. He wept and won his life, our pity too. Priam takes command, has him freed from the ropes and chains that bind him fast, and hails him warmly. So this, by the way, is a reflection of the Trojan horse itself. So Priam is a reflection, all deception is a reflection of the Trojan horse. He wept and won his life, our pity too. Priam takes command, has him freed from the ropes and chains that bind him fast, and hails him warmly, just as they hailed warmly the horse, right? So they buy into the deception, they hail in the false thing, they buy into the deception of the horse, they bring it in, okay? So this is just kind of a recurring theme here of deception. Also, there's this idea of being trapped, right? Trapped in the language in the Aeneid. It's like trapped by his craft, that cunning liar. Sinon, we believed his story, his tears, his treachery, seized the men whom neither Tydeus son nor Achilles could defeat, nor 10 long years of war, not all the 1,000 ships. Okay, so 10 long years of war, all the 1,000 ships couldn't penetrate the gates of Troy. It was deception that then they wheeled it into the very heart of their city. That's the trap. Okay, so trapped by his craft. There's a continued theme of deception where the Trojans are actually wearing the Greek armor when basically, everything goes down. There's confusion on some of the Greeks' part coming in to lay waste to Troy. They get caught by Aeneas and some of his men, and some of the Greeks in that confusion, in that kind of lost, blind kind of theme here, the Greeks think that they're they think that they're part of the Greeks. They think that Trojans, Aeneas and a group of his men are part of the Greeks, and they say, are you here to do such and such? But he gets too close is the point, and he gets killed. So the Greeks get killed, and then they actually, Aeneas and his men, the Trojans, put on the Greek armor, and then continued through that line of deceit. So there's just constant deceit throughout the story, and it's all reflective of the same idea that there's this outer superficial layer that is a trap that we accept or get too close to, and that is our doom. Okay, so that's kind of the main idea, and so there's an idolatry associated with that deception. Okay, there's an idolatry, is right the golden calf. That's a false god. Okay, and so when we get fixated on the false image, we tend to regard it as grand and sacred. When we get caught, entrapped in that deception, we regard it as something immense as a mountain. In the language of the Aeneid, it says, mammoth horse, immense as a mountain, lining its ribs with ship timbers honed from pine, an offering to secure safe passage home. So they're attributing all of these grand and noble features to this thing that's going to be the end of them, that's going to cause the fall of Troy. We have language like wonderstruck and transfixed. So it says, some gaze wonderstruck at the gift for Pallas Athena, the virgin never wed, transfixed by the horse, its looming mass, our doom. So there's this language of idolatry, basically. You're elevating something beyond what it is. You're not only being deceived by it, you're actually praising it. You're putting it in a position and place above what is due, above what is proper. You're glorifying this thing, and that is their doom. That's part of the deception, but that's also an idolatry. Is the point, right? With the words like wonderstruck, transfixed, mesmerized by it, right? One of the Trojans says, "Drag it inside the walls, plant it high on the city heights." Right. So again, it's like, bring it in, accept it, put it on the city heights, right? Putting it above, putting it in the highest point, the center of the city. So also, as they were wheeling in the Trojan horse, Aeneas says, 4 times the armor clashed out from its womb, but we forged ahead, oblivious, blind, insane. We stationed the monster fraught with doom on the hallowed heights of Troy. Later, it says, the horse stands towering high in the heart of Troy. Okay? So all of this is from their idleness, not paying attention, by just casually, lazily accepting the superficial image. We get pulled into that deception, masterpiece of fraud. What is the parallel in BVS on that? Just that phrase, masterpiece of fraud. That's actually, again, uttered in the Aeneid. That deception, we get, that deception is a trap that creates this behavior of idolatry around the false thing. Okay, they now are deceived to believe that this thing is sacred. so sacred you should bring it in immediately, put it in the center and heart and heights of your city. Okay? This is the path to destruction, right? Also, it says, but he made them do the work on a grand scale. So this is Sinon kind of spinning the web, saying how they constructed it. But he made them do the work on a grand scale, a tremendous mass of interlocking timbers towering toward the sky, so the horse could not be trundled through your gates or hauled inside your walls or guard your people if they revered it well in the old ancient way. So revere. So he's spinning something to get them to revere it and see it as sacred. And so he's saying that they made it so big so that you couldn't bring it in the city and gain favor from the gods. So it wasn't a direct gift to the Trojans. It's a bit more subtle than that, because he's saying you aren't supposed to bring it in, right? He's using reverse psychology. They don't want you to bring it in. But if your hands rear it up into your city, then all Asia in arms can invade Greece, can launch an all-out war right up to the walls of Pelops. That's the doom that awaits our sons' So he's saying, if you violate this thing, then total disaster is going to come upon you. But if you wheel it in your city, you'll be able to take over Greece, right? It's a complete inversion of the truth, right? So that Trojan horse was for Greece to invade Troy, okay, and not the other way around. But he's painting it as if it's the opposite thing. So, but he's using the language, grand scale, reverence, rear it up, revere it in the old way, the old ancient way, right? So he's really giving a sense of sacred nature. It's his grand sacred nature, which is an idolatry, right? He's rearing it up as an idol, basically. And then they bring it in to their center of their city. That's idolatry. They're actually acting out on that. Also, there's language of when they celebrate after they bring it in, right? So, and we poor fools on this, our last day, this is Aeneas, we deck the shrines of the gods with green holiday garlands all throughout the city. So they celebrate. That's, again, idolatry. They're celebrating this false image. Okay, so there's also this theme of desecration where, in the picture on the bottom right, it's Laocoon and his sons killed by a pair of twin snakes that emerge from the sea as what's described as rearing coils. Okay, so the Trojans interpret that occurring because of him throwing the spear. Remember, he's the one that threw the spear at the wooden horse, and they believe that's why he was killed. So after that occurs, after those snakes come up and and kill both his sons and himself, it says, I tell you, a stranger fear runs through the herald crowd. Laocoon deserved to pay for his outrage, so they say. He desecrated the sacred timbers of the horse. He hurled his wicked lance at the beast's back. Laocoon's scream is described when he's getting killed. His priestly bands splattered in filth, black venom, and all the while his horrible scream fills the skies. And so his priestly bands splattered in filth. So priestly is something sacred, splattered in filth, that's something vile. And so priestly bands being splattered in filth, that's a desecration as well, right? So there's this theme of something that should be sacred or is viewed as sacred, and from some perspective, it's being trashed, destroyed, filth is thrown upon it, and that sort of thing. That's a common theme throughout this as well. And there's the general desecration related to the actual fall of Troy itself, right? So Troy is like this big grand city, so you can think of the destruction of that city as a desecration when people start dying. And so in the beginning of this, the final hours of Troy, Aeneas is like, sorrow, unspeakable sorrow, my queen. You ask me to bring to life once more how the Greeks uprooted Troy in all her power. Our kingdom mourned forever. What horrors I saw, a tragedy where I played a leading role myself. So there's this power, kingdom that's been destroyed. And so that's like a desecration of the entire area. Okay. There's also language like 1,000 shapes of death and city up in flames, right? So it says an ancient city is falling, a power that ruled for ages now in ruins, right? So a power, a grand thing, now in ruins. It's been desecrated. Everywhere lie the motionless bodies of the dead strewn in her streets, okay? So when they talked about the slumbering, when they were slumbering, remember in their idleness, when they're celebrating the wooden horse, they use that language as well, strewn in the streets. That's a direct mirror, a parallel to, sleeping and being drunk as being now dead in the streets. So that's really interesting. It's like all throughout. Everywhere, wrenching, grief, everywhere, terror, and 1,000 shapes of death. The Greeks are lording over our city up in flames. Aeneas says, into the blaze I dive into the fray wherein the din of combat breaks and war cries fill the sky. Later he says, who has words to capture that night's disaster, tell that slaughter, right? So all of these elements, there's carelessness, thoughtlessness, idleness, kind of a willing ignorance, a willful ignorance, blind slumber, buried deep in sleep and wine. You're allowing the signs to go over your head, not acting on them properly. You buy into a deception. That deception becomes an idolatry, right? So it's a beautiful thing. It's a masterpiece of fraud. So it's a masterpiece. It's extravagant. It's big. It's immense. It has you wonderstruck. You're transfixed by it. Planted high, grand scale, right? So through that deception, we elevate the wrong thing. What results? Desecration. Okay. So I go deeply into that because now we can see all of these themes, throughout. Idolatry is a beautiful lie, right? It's a false god, false idol, beautiful lie, okay? And so the phrase masterpiece of fraud is the beautiful lie. The phrase uttered in the Aeneid, masterpiece of fraud. That's how Aeneas describes it. It's a masterpiece of fraud. Masterpiece, beautiful. Lie, fraud, right? This is the idea. There's something beautiful that captures our attention, that deceives us into thinking that superficial aspect is its true nature, but it's not its true nature. So, the horse and the calf, the Trojan horse and the calf, are propped up in celebratory complacency, a self-satisfied exuberance that forgets or ignores the true God or the true good in favor of the false thing, the deceptive thing, the illusory thing, treating it as if it's sacred, putting it in the center of their holy space, when in fact the hollow shell of a horse or the golden calf is the source of their destruction. In their idleness, their carelessness, thoughtlessness, inattentiveness, right, to what is right, what is good, what is careful, what is true, what is proper, the holy work, they accept in their holy space the false image, also known as a beautiful lie. Right? So that's the beautiful lie. The beautiful lie is golden, shimmering, alluring, materialistic, showy, beautiful. One of the main features of the Trojan horse is how big it is, right? They were captivated and transfixed by it. They take the false god, the idol, beyond the temple gateway. They dance and sing around it, treat it as a pure thing, as an innocent thing. In this spiritual slumber, they are drunken and blind to its true nature. They are deceived by its showiness. The Greeks come out of the horse, slaughtering the Trojans, thus the fall of Troy. Okay? So idol worship is a spiritual desecration, careless disregard for the good, idleness with respect to the holy work, right? There's this phase captured in these images, acceptance of illusory or false figures, ideas, activities, attachments, a state of blithe ignorance, blind to the truth, alluring, beautiful lie, illusion. Okay, so that's what's happening here. And the point, remember, the Greeks came out of the horse, slaughtering the Trojans, thus the fall of Troy. The point is that there is a subsequent fall, right? This is the message, okay? Lest we forget, Moses had the Levites kill about 3,000 or so of the idolaters of the golden calf. Okay, so these stories, the Trojan horse and the golden calf, really do parallel each other, and no, it's not by coincidence. They're conveying the same ideas intentionally, because it's a really important concept of illusion and deception, and the consequences of that illusion and deception, the consequences of that false god, right? So in Exodus 32:26-28, it says, "Then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, 'Who is on the Lord's side? Let him come unto me.' And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together unto him. And he said unto them, Thus saith the Lord of God, Israel, put every man his sword by his side, and go in and out from gate to gate throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother, every man his companion, and every man his neighbor. And the children of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and there fell of the people that day about 3,000 men." Okay? So this is a very direct parallel. There is God's wrath, right? Moses is commanded by God. Didn't the 10 Commandments say, "Thou shalt not kill"? Well, if the covenant of the good is broken, then the wrath of God is experienced. You get killed, right? There's a physical desecration now, right? So first it's a spiritual desecration when we glorify the false thing, when we idolatrize the false thing. Modern day, you might think of something like celebrity worship, yeah, cult of personality around these politicians, right? We'll talk about that, but that's a modern form of idolatry. What results is a physical desecration, an outward desecration of false idols. So everything is brought down. There is a destruction that occurs for all involved. Fire or flood of blood. Okay, painful, unapologetic, shocking, iconoclasm, right? The destruction of icons. Moses is an iconoclast. Zack Snyder is an iconoclast. There's a necessary destruction of the way things are, the established order. There's a complacency, a spiritual decay. The iconoclast comes in to desecrate these unholy images and put us on the humble and right track of the holy work. Okay, that desecration is supposed to humble us toward what is true and proper, not some complacent, spiritually idle state of being, right? So the iconoclast is a very important idea. It's this idea of desecration of false images, all right? So this is the state. And so you can ask, was Moses right to kill them? That's murder, isn't it? That's not the point. You're not supposed to be thinking about it on that level. There's a simple statement of cause and effect here. First of all, it's about severity. It's saying that idolatry has severe consequences. Heed that warning, right? So idolatry has extremely severe consequences. 2, it's more like cause and effect. If you engage, if this idolatry is allowed to run rampant, you engage in that, you glorify false things, destruction will result. Okay, destruction will result as a cause and effect. Like, it's not really about can we be forgiven at that point? The point is, there's a time where you can repent, let's say. Let's use that language. There's a time where you can repent and perhaps gain the mercy of God, okay? Where there isn't that desecration and destruction. But after a time, it's going to be too late. There's a notion of too late. If it's too late, you incur God's wrath, right? God's wrath is simply the personification of this cause and effect reality of idolatry and desecration of the idolatry, the iconoclasm, the cleansing by cataclysm, right? So they're necessary parts of this process, okay? So in the Exodus, the Israelites accepted into their own hearts and minds and space a false image. That's the aspect here. If we willingly, blindly, carelessly, casually accept in these idolatrous images, in our hearts, our minds, our sacred spaces, this false image is propped up, that will lead to your doom. In Troy, the Trojans accepted into their city, into the heart of their city heights, a false image, a hollow horse that led to their doom. Okay. It's just cause and effect. It's not, is God right to do this, or it's like we all going down, right? If idolatry is allowed to run rampant. And so the question is, well, we can talk about things like Noah and the ark as well. So the flood is one such example of that same thing. When things go bad, when the city is allowed to engage in all sorts of sin, basically wrapped up in this concept of idolatry, maybe there's a boat we can build in preparation for the impending doom, right? The impending unapologetic doom, right? So remember, there's people here that are idol dancing in this picture, right? They're being careless. They're not actively worshiping here, right? So you could say they're celebrating the idolatrous image, but I like to think that even if you're being careless and, I wasn't actively participating in it, ignorance is not the same as innocence, right? So in their ignorance, in their idleness, you're guilty as well. Anybody who's acquiescing to the false image, we all going down. Okay? That's what it is. All right? So that's the idea. This is a very general idea, right? The vampire is an image of the demon or the devil, okay? Where they have to first be invited into the house. That's part of the lore. The kind of classic lore is they have to be invited in. We invite these idolatrous images. The Trojans wheeled in their horse, right? Force couldn't get them past the gates, couldn't get the Greeks past the gates of Troy. They had to use deception to have them invite into their home this false idol, this false god, right? This false sacred thing, this source of their doom, okay? So vampires are often portrayed as handsome, right? Based on societal standards of beauty, yes? Charming, charismatic in the standard societal manner of charisma, right? Often they can be wealthy, right? They have all the good stuff. They have all the flashy, beautiful things, right? But vampires are also a beautiful lie, a masterpiece of fraud. They're seductive, playing on our pull toward idolatry of material worldly pleasures, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. They act charming and charismatic so that you may lower your guard. Again, through idleness, a kind of arrogant complacency for worldly pleasures, put above or prioritized against the holy work of God's divine will, is the only sin. And it paves the way toward greater destruction. But the key is that idolatry has to be invited into the heart. It doesn't get there unless we allow it to get there, right? So it can't come in unless we ourselves wheel it in, our own inner temple, our own mind, our own heart. Fall of Troy, the golden calf, the Trojan horse, the forbidden fruit are but reflections of the same idea. Man in his idleness and complacency enables himself to be deceived, accepting into his heart the dangerous deception of false idols. This is not a sin, it is the first and only sin. It is the idle disregard for the will of God, or the will of the good, a lack of attentiveness or lack of mindfulness of the proper thing, the truly holy, putting the lazy animalistic or beastly temptations symbolized in the bull or calf above what is right, what is truly holy, right? Prioritized against the divine work of the good. A spiritual chaos in the mind projected outwardly to support the hollow image, the false image, the alluring materialistic or worldly image, the spiritual red herring. I can't say this enough. I repeat myself intentionally because this is a very extremely, extremely important idea. Maybe if Laocoon repeated a couple more times the idea that no, there is really something wrong here. Okay, guys, I know you heard me the first time, but are you hearing me again? This is seriously wrong. Okay. So we have Wheeling and Wallace. Okay, so Wallace Vernon Keefe in the wheelchair is much like the Trojan horse, the object of massacre, cloaked in an innocent exterior. Everyone's guard is down because who would suspect something so horrific connected with something so seemingly harmless and innocent? So we project onto this thing a false sense of comfort and holiness and purity related to his victimhood being used to cloak something that is of severe consequence, right? So he's a victim without legs. Certainly he couldn't pose any threat to innocent lives, right? And so that's part of the deception. And more precisely, the Trojan horse is the wheelchair itself, right? That's the false gift, right? Lex Luthor gifted this wheelchair, this alluring, flashy wheelchair, containing the means to slaughter. So Lex sort of represents, the Greeks bearing gifts, right? He's Alexander the Great. Laocoon is like, be wary of Greeks bearing gifts, like this is the thing. And so he bestows upon Wallace Vernon Keefe the gift of his own destruction, essentially, just like the Trojan horse, right? And so the Trojan horse is super fancy, technologically advanced, right? It's alluring, it's transfixing, it's mesmerizing, it's technologically advanced, right? So reflecting the idea that the Trojan horse itself was propped up and treated as like this grand, big, immense thing. The wheelchair, the new wheelchair, is now elevating Wallace Vernon Keefe and kind of lowering his guard because that's part of what that is. It's like, here, take this. I'm being nice to you, okay? and then he feels comforted by Lex's deception, okay? And so this is the true, dangerous, and deceptive nature of the false idol, the seemingly innocent, the seemingly holy or pure. We project a false sense of innocence onto the wheelchair, right? And Wallace Vernon Keefe, in conjunction with the wheelchair, is like this false sense of safety because it's like, it's just a guy in a wheelchair, but there's a bomb inside, right? And so, as is done by the worshippers of Superman. So Superman has actually worshippers and those that demonize him. So there's an idolatry associated with both, right? So both are projecting onto this thing a false sense of what is true inside. There's a humble truth inside, but there's a false projection and therefore an idolatry surrounding Superman, right? And so it's important to note, I want to really note that there are two forms of idolatry that I'm looking at here. So there's the idolatry of infatuation, right? There's this positive thing, elevating this thing beyond what is proper to elevate it. And then there's the contrary, the mirror image of that, which is the hating of Superman, right? So falsely projecting all responsibility onto Superman is also a kind of idolatry. And so that's what Batman does. And so you see it also reflected in the statement later when there's, that news piece, that montage where the guy's like, maybe he's not some devil or Jesus character, right? So he's not the devil and he's not Jesus, right? And he's not this God, shimmering God on the hill, man in the sky type of. Both cases leads to the same consequence of idolatry. And so, again, this idea is reflected in Zack Snyder's Justice League as well. So Wonder Woman says, hate is useless.
I hate Atlanteans as much as you Amazons do.
Hate is useless.
Right, so hate is also an idle thing. It's an idle activity. Idle hatred is also leading to idolatry. In this case, you're worshiping perhaps your own sense of self-righteousness, right? That is a lazy attitude, since it's a rejection of doing the divine work reflected in seeking out the truth and in all its nuance and complexity, right? So to hate something, to demonize something, is to put more stake than is due to that thing. To be infatuated by something, that is putting more stake than what is due for that thing. So it really is about deception, and there are different ways of projecting that idolatry. And so the point is that with this picture, there's this sort of celebratory complacency surrounding Capitol Hill. Everyone's just fine and content with going to extremes and having these extreme emotions without doing the holy work. The only one who's really doing the holy work, let me get a green color, is her, right? And so Lois Lane actually very much resembles Cassandra. Cassandra was one of the characters, one of the Trojans in the myth of the Trojan horse. Her curse, Cassandra's curse, was that she would prophesize truth, right? So she would also, like Laocoon, called it out for what it was, but no one believed her, right? And that was her curse, is like she would always be giving true prophecy. However, no one would ever believe her. And this is a lot like what Lois Lane goes through.
Is the U.S. providing experimental military arms to rebels in Africa?
You know, with balls like yours, you belong in here. What's your source on this? A tinfoil hat?
Press your reporter. Think Watergate.
Yeah, and you need to think litigate. If you're wrong, Luther will sue the paper out of existence. You need proof.
I am not going to risk the paper so that you can pass notes in class to the man that rescued you.
She is doing the divine work. At the end of the day, she's doing the divine work of seeking out the truth. So she represents, in many ways, reflects a lot of what Cassandra is in the story of the fall of Troy. And so, as the Trojan horse was, Wallace passes the temple guardians and gateway on wheels. The photographers eager to take pictures, right? So there's an idolatry around his victimhood. Is it really about coming together and reaching an understanding? Is it about that truth? Is it about that true holy work? Or is it about the spectacle of the moment, right? Is it about the superficial spectacle giving people reason to judge others and feel good about themselves, right? So he passes through the gateway because people aren't really concerned about doing what's right, are they? They're concerned about the spectacle. They're concerned about the show. And so the cameras, the flashing photography, the people outside, they're all engaging in a similar type of celebratory complacency with not doing the holy work of investigating, finding out the truth in a carefully controlled, proper manner, right? So everyone's being idle in that regard, complacent with their idolatry of the moment. And so you have idolatry of hatred, demonizing Superman. You have idolatry of infatuation, elevating him beyond, right? But really, he's just a guy trying to do the right thing. It's that simple, right? But there's all this, excessive attitude that leads them into their destruction, basically, okay? Granny's peach tea, right? We have the jar of piss, a classic image of desecration and defilement, cloaked in a superficial, holy, and innocent exterior. The label itself, Granny's peach tea, right? That's innocent, hiding the wicked thing inside. Sitting in the holy temple, defiling its sacred character merely by being there. It conveys, among other things, Lex's attitude of disgust toward the entire process, as well as his personal anger toward Senator Finch. So I also want to say here that why is the jar of piss? Why do we have a jar of piss? Well, from one point of view, it's sort of the classic image of desecration. When you hear about someone pissing on someone's grave, that's defiling the sacred character of that person's corpse and the holiness of that person and the grave itself, which is supposed to reflect, a holy remembrance of that person. So if you piss on someone's grave, you're pissing on something holy. It's a desecration of the holy space. Like how do you desecrate an entire space? You effectively piss on it. And the hue, notice the hue of the piss and the fire is the same, right? So remember last time I talked about the gun and the phallus. Well, what comes out of the gun? What comes out of the phallus? Fire, piss, right? So fire is related to the masculine, typically. Fire is related to the intellect as well, right? So knowledge, right? So when Prometheus brought fire to mankind, he brought knowledge, he brought the intellect. That's a masculine principle. We're talking generally, spiritually, esoterically, and so forth. Fire represents the masculine principle. Fire represents the phallus. And that what comes out of the gun, if the gun is a phallus and fire comes out of the gun, well, what is that? What is the fire? The fire is also piss when it's taken to its extreme, right? It's pissing on something holy. And so we have that parallel, that visual parallel, is that he's actually flooding the building with piss, with the intellect, with this gross adherence to, a masculine manner of doing things. That's like Alexander using brute force to cut the Gordian knot. The blade itself is a masculine thing, using brute force to cut the Gordian knot. This outward excessive use of aggression is the unrestrained masculine principle, again reflected in the piss that comes out of that phallus. He is pissing on the holy hill of the people, a desecration of the space, their dead bodies, and the sacred process of people coming together to reach an understanding. That whole thing is a very holy process, holy people coming together. We have Wallace, Vernon Keefe, Superman, Senator Finch, and everyone else seeing what's about to take place, truth about to come out, and he pisses on all of it, right? That's the point. He's setting up, Zack Snyder is setting up this very holy thing that's about to take place and cutting it off, right? Defiling it, right? Because that's what the true villain does. The true villain does not care one iota about your notions of holiness. They care about their own personal agenda, ego-driven agenda. And so in the Aeneid, Aeneas describes the fallen city of Troy. So what tears could match our torments, he says. What tears can match our torments now? An ancient city is falling, a power that ruled for ages, now in ruins. Everywhere lie the motionless bodies of the dead strewn in her streets, her homes, and the gods' shrines we held in awe. And not only Trojans pay the price of blood, at times the courage races back in their triumph. Everywhere wrenching grief, everywhere terror in 1,000 shapes of death. So much like Wallace's fancy new wheelchair has an alluring superficial exterior, the jar of piss has the superficial label of something innocent, pure, and holy. Granny's peach tea, right? But its inner nature is profane, lewd, wicked, and vile, belonging in the gutter or the sewer. Certainly not on the Holy of Holy bench inside the Capitol building next to the holy host of the proceedings, right? So the wheelchair is flashy, it's new, it looks nice, but it's hiding the desecrating image inside. Okay, this is therefore an extension of the Trojan horse, where what is brought in has a superficial exterior of the holy, of the innocent, but its insides are actually the source of one's demise, one's fall from the garden, the fall of Troy. And so you can even think about the red Granny's peach tea. It's a peach. It's peach. It's Granny. That represents something innocent. Peach, that's a fruit. So the redness, she's she's eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? So when she turns that thing, that redness, that peach, is the forbidden fruit. When she turns that, now she knows. Now she knows the true nature of the wicked, right? Before, and we'll talk about this later, but before she didn't actually know. She was ignorant. When she turns that, then she knows. She knows the full extent of the true nature of the wicked beast. Okay. So this is the forbidden fruit. This is the Trojan horse. This is the golden calf. All of these things, right? It's golden. You got the piss. It's Granny. We got the innocence. Peach. We got the forbidden fruit. It's all there. Okay. Given that the label on the jar of piss has the word Granny, we might think, oh, well, that's connected to, isn't there a Granny in the Little Red Riding Hood? Yes. And if that was it, if that was the only connection, there's nothing else, then it'd just be an interesting coincidence. However, if you look at the story of the Little Red Riding Hood, it has exactly the same themes and ideas as the Trojan horse and the golden calf and all of these things, right? So we may connect it with the tale reasonably so. It's a tale of deception, right? It's a tale of trickery, right? So in the original story, the wolf asks Little Red Riding Hood where she's going, and she says, I'm going to see my grandmother and carry her a cake and a little pot of butter from my mother. The wolf asks, does she live far off? And Little Red Riding Hood says, it is beyond the mill, you see. there at the first house in the village. So Little Red Riding Hood herself points out her grandmother's house to a wolf. We've talked about that kind of carelessness, right? And so the wolf knocked on the door, and the grandmother asked who it was, to which the wolf replied, "Your grandchild, Little Red Riding Hood," replied the wolf, counterfeiting her voice. "Who has brought you a cake and a little pot of butter sent you by mother." So he's just echoing her words, right? The good grandmother, who was in bed because she was somewhat ill, cried out, "Pull the bobbin and the latch will go up." So the grandmother's being a bit careless. Saying the doors, you can open the door yourself. Like, it's not even like locked in any sense. So go ahead, come on in. So the grandmother is kind of being careless as well. What happens as a result? He comes in and eats the grandmother. That's it. There's no, that's it for the grandmother. In the original tale, that's it for the grandmother, right? And so he then wears the grandmother's clothes, a superficial exterior, hiding his wicked, evil, ugly character. Right, so there's a superficial exterior of Granny. Little Red Riding Hood knocks as the wolf pretends to be the grandmother. She then comes in and in the classic sequence of observation says, "What big arms you have, what big legs you have, what big ears you have, what big teeth you have," right? So there's these signs she's not even listening to, all the while getting closer to the unholy image and emphasizing how big it is, right? Just like in the story of the Trojan horse, they're like, "Oh my God, it's immense, mammoth," right? Immense is a mountain. It's a mammoth, giant thing. They're idolatrizing it and ignoring the signs surrounding that, right? So they get consumed by the idolatry, the deception of the idolatry. Pulls them in. Little Red Riding Hood gets closer, and only then can the wolf actually act out. So the wolf was invited in, and the Little Red Riding Hood invited herself closer to the wolf. So notice that in both cases, the wolf isn't actually chasing them in any way. The only way he gets close is through that carelessness, that thoughtless idolatry, basically. And so in the original story, Little Red Riding Hood gets eaten. And that's it. End of the story. You engage in idolatry, bad things happen, bad irreversible things happen, and that's it. And in later versions, there's like an axe. There's a hunter with an axe, and he like cuts open the wolf, and then Granny and Little Red Riding Hood are freed. But I like the original story. I like the fact that it really emphasizes the true danger, right? So in the idolatry of the golden calf, 3,000 people are slaughtered by Moses at the command of God. Troy is burned and slaughtered, right? Little Red Riding Hood and Granny eaten by the idolatry of the superficial layer. Okay, they get distracted in their thoughtless and carelessness, invite in or embrace the false image. Okay, and this is a big idea. It's everywhere. There's an underestimation of the stakes and what can result, basically, right? And that's what's reflected in the Little Red Riding Hood. So, convinced to come down upon a pretense of Granny's goodness, only to be swallowed up whole by the wickedness of the wolf. He sits confused inside the belly of the beast. So here he's like inside. He's consumed by the fires, flames, wickedness. He's in the belly, right? He's in the belly of the beast. He's just like the wolf consumed Little Red Riding Hood. He is now consumed in that fire, in the reality of that, the ugly reality of that. So Wallace Vernon Keefe's wheelchair alludes to this idea as well. It's the Trojan horse, of course, right? Superman then is like Little Red Riding Hood. Again, he's got the red cape, right? All that fits nice and visually, but he enters the house like Little Red Riding Hood, the temple, the Capitol building, upon naive expectation of an optimistic outcome. I've talked a lot about how they're connected, but I really want to emphasize what it means in the context of deception, how idleness and idolatry really are connected to each other. Superman, for instance, is concerned of this very aspect of idleness. He didn't or he thinks he's responsible, right? He treats himself as if he was responsible. He's like, I didn't see it, Lo.
I didn't see it, Lo. Standing right there and I didn't see it.
Clark, there are people behind this.
I'm afraid I didn't see it because I wasn't looking.
And he said he's afraid he didn't see it because he wasn't looking. He's afraid he didn't see it because he wasn't looking. What he means is he's afraid he wasn't paying attention and heeding signs around him and carefully thinking about what was actually happening before stepping into the Holy Temple, right? He's afraid he was being careless in the same way that Little Red Riding Hood or the Trojans were careless and inattentive, ignoring the signs around them. You see, there's a responsibility, and this is the holy work, for all capable to seek out the truth, to not be misguided and misled by false illusions, okay? The idea is echoed when Lois Lane is told by Amajag, ignorance is not the same as innocence, right? So what does that mean? That means there's a guilt associated with people who may be ignorant. Well, if you're ignorant because it's your fault, then you're guilty, right? If you're willfully ignorant, that means you're idling in the holy work. So part of the holy work, a big part of the holy work, is to seek out the truth and to not stop seeking out the truth. All right, so if you stop seeking out the truth, you're idling. Even if you pull back some layers and then you just stop and you just kind of stay there and you're complacent with where you're at, that's idling. The holy work is continuous. There's constantly layers to peel back. If you stagnate in that, you've idled in the holy work. You've idolatrized the accomplishments thus far, things as they are. You've idolatrized effectively a new superficial layer. Okay, it gets deep, man. It gets deep. So Superman feels guilty because he's afraid he wasn't looking. He's afraid he wasn't maintaining and doing the holy work of seeing things as they are. It's our job as sentient vessels vessels for the spirit of the good or the spirit of God, whatever you want to call it, to seek out things as they are, to see the truth of things and to not idle in that process, to continually peel back layers and to not be fixated on your own idolatry of your own self and your own accomplishments, but also others as well. So it's a very complicated work. Has a lot of traps in that process, right? And we have to keep reminding ourselves to keep peeling back the layers honestly, sincerely, to get at the truth of something. So he's upset. He's afraid he didn't see it because he wasn't looking. He's afraid he didn't see the truth because he wasn't looking. He's afraid he was idling in that holy work, right? And this is emphasized again with the paths of these characters: Batman, Superman, and Lois. So Bruce, Clark, and Lois. What do they all do at some point in the film? They all do some manner of investigation to find out the truth. Humble investigation. Clark goes to Gotham City, asks people questions, tries to get at truth. Bruce Wayne gets invited to Lex Luthor's house and tries to actually get information, right? Doing it the right way, right? So there's this investigative aspect that they've tried to do, and that's being portrayed as the good version of what they're actually trying to do, and instead of kind of adhering to the idolatry of their own image, right? So Batman, it gets consumed a bit by his idolatry, his worship of the image of the bat, and his idolatrous hatred toward Superman, right? So he's self-satisfied. This guy is the demon, and he's satisfied with that false thinking. That's idolatry. Superman, just the same, gets caught up in his own idolatry and sort of enforces this tyrannical, authoritative, top-down approach towards Batman. So he gets caught up in demonizing Batman and idolatry of himself, just as Batman does for Superman. And so who's the one that actually followed the path of investigation to peel back the layers throughout the entire process? Lois Lane. Lois Lane is representing the one that's peeling back the layers of truth and doing that solid, true, rational, focused, and sincere investigation of peeling back the layers. Lois Lane is the best example for doing the divine work in this movie, right? The holy work. So at first, she engages in idolatry, and she has her stumbling blocks, sure, but over the long course of this movie, the period of this movie, she's the one that's actually peeling back the layers.
I didn't kill those men, if that's what they think, if that's what you're saying.
I'm saying I want to understand what happened.
She's the one that's actually doing that hard, difficult work to get at the truth. And again, she's like Cassandra, who is able to then prophesize what's about to occur. But it's through that divine work that the situation was actually solved. If she wasn't continuing that process of peeling back layers, just that one little bit of truth was enough to save both Superman and Batman. So it's a lot of interesting stuff happening in here. The holy work is to stay vigilant and seek the truth instead of, in our idleness, being a victim to the beautiful lies of the Trojan horses, the golden calves, the forbidden fruit, the masterpiece of fraud, okay, of the original and only sin of idolatry. Okay, let's look at Senator Finch now. So despite Senator Finch's capabilities in seeing past a lot of Lex's chicanery, she was still careless and self-satisfied to a point, right? She spoke against him loudly in the hallway.
He's been using the committee as his puppet theater. Senator, not you.
All of this is her carelessness, right? She is underestimating, effectively, Lex and what he's capable of, right? So she spoke loudly against him. She felt a sense of pride when saying she knows how to wrestle a pig.
I grew up on a farm. I know how to wrestle a pig.
So it's, again, pride comes before the fall. She is complacent with where she's at, with the truth that she has found. She hasn't found the full truth yet, right? Lex himself says exactly what the truth is.
Do you know the oldest lie in America, Senator? It's that power can be innocent.
And to me, this is the key to understanding the full extent of idolatry, right? So remember, it's not just, idolatry isn't just worshiping some outward thing. It can also be demonizing some outward thing, which is in worshiping your own self-righteousness in some sense. And further, though, idolatry is any sense of complacency related to a false projection onto something, right? So a false estimation of the stakes is idolatry. Complacency with a false perception is idolatry, okay? It's not enough to see the guilt of those that wield profane power in government or corporations or politics. If you falsely assess their level of guilt and therefore falsely project a level of innocence onto them that isn't real, that is so too idolatrous. It typically occurs in some manner of the following phrase, and I'm sure you've heard this. In some way, this is what people want to believe, right? They want to believe the beautiful lie. I know X is bad, so X can be a government entity, a person, or whatever. I know X is bad, but X wouldn't do that, would they? They wouldn't do that, right? I know the CIA is bad, but they wouldn't be that bad, right? I know the government is corrupt, but they're not that corrupt, right? They wouldn't be that corrupt, right? I know the governmental and military powers are bad, but they wouldn't knowingly and intentionally kill innocent men, women, and babies for their own power and greed. They wouldn't do that to their own citizens, right? So you can admit guilt on something. You can say, I know they're bad. I don't worship them. But you kind of are anyway when you say they wouldn't do that, right? And you're complacent with that falsehood. Because the reality is they would do that because they have done that. And that information's already out there. And so when you project a false sense of innocence, a false level of guilt, a false level of innocence, and you're complacent in that, that is idolatry in some manner. Okay? And so this was the mistake, right? This was Senator Finch's mistake. she underestimated how vicious and cruel Lex could actually be. And therefore, corporations, governments, CIA, all these people in power, Lex is saying, it's a lie that power can be innocent, right? So he's saying, just straight up, people in power have done horrible, horrible, horrible things, either to get there or to maintain their power. Okay, so friends, it is not enough to see something, a person, a power, a government entity, or any such thing as bad or wrong. It is idolatry to assume they won't go to the very lowest depths of evil to enact their own agenda, to obtain or maintain their power structure, the unholy hierarchy. It is the idolatry of underestimation of their level of guilt, right? A complacency in a falsehood, a false god, Granny's clothing covering up the unholy wolf, right? So thereby falsely attributing a level of innocence that is simply not there. Little Red Riding Hood wanted to believe it was her grandmother despite the signs. The Trojans wanted to believe that the horse was a holy gift for Athena. A person wants to buy into the disarming charms of the satanic vampire and accept them into their house. Friends, when you buy into the superficial narrative, the superficial label of Granny's peach tea, you have invited into your own sacred space the devil of your own undoing, the devil of your own desecration. The message is this: if we do not keep a careful eye, if we are inattentive or not vigilant in the hard and divine work of seeking the truth, removing the veil of illusion, if we let our guard down, if we become idle, we acquiesce or embrace the false image, the false idol with open arms, destroying everything else that we might hold sacred. He comes in, pretends to be a friend, and gets close enough. And Lois Lane allows him to get close enough, despite kind of calling him out. She still lets him join her. Her carelessness lets in someone pretending to be a photographer, lets in someone into the holy temple, right? Just like the gates of Troy. The superficial layer is the camera, right? But inside it is a source of collapse, deception, CIA infiltration. You actually see this presented by when the camera, the superficial layer, is desecrated. So there's a desecration. Anatoly is like, no, that's not actually what it appears to be. That's not actually this innocent, holy thing. I'm going to dismantle it and show the truth. And that's what he does, okay? And this then leads to wrath, right? So there's the wrath of Amajag upon seeing the unholy desecration of the CIA infiltration, and the truth of the Trojan horse of Jimmy Olsen, right? So he sees that, and then there's wrath and destruction that ultimately results upon Jimmy being a Trojan horse. All right, so the corporate mercenaries, Anatoly and his men, are another Trojan horse, right? So they pretend to be friends with Amajag, right? They pretend to be innocent security contractors, right? Just doing an innocent job. Note that they also ride out on wheeled horses, right? So remember, one of the main kind of ideas of the Trojan horse is that they wheeled it in. It didn't charge in. They brought it in. It was wheeled in. Anatoly rides out on wheeled horses, juxtaposed to Python and his men riding on real horses, organic horses, right? True horses, right? In Amajag's carelessness, he accepts the unholy Anatoly. In other words, Anatoly is anti-holy, posing as a friend, a security contractor, as a Trojan horse. He is another source of their downfall, paralleling the fall of Troy. False flag operation is an act committed with the intent of disguising the actual source of responsibility and pinning blame on another party. The term false flag originated in the 16th century as an expression meaning an intentional misrepresentation of someone's allegiance. The term was famously used to describe a ruse in naval warfare whereby a vessel flew the flag of a neutral or enemy country in order to hide its true identity. The tactic was originally used by pirates and privateers to deceive other ships into allowing them to move closer before attacking them. It later was deemed an acceptable practice during naval warfare according to international maritime laws, providing the attacking vessel displayed its true flag once an attack had begun. So I want to emphasize two things here, is that there's a Trojan horse-like nature to a false flag, where you pretend to be friendly or holy, that allows you to get close or gain access to someone's sacred space, temple, vessel, whatever it is, and then you kind of unleash the truth upon them and destroy them in some manner, right? That's how initially that term was used, false flag. You're pretending to be neutral or friendly. So there's false sense of friendliness, but now actually it's more often seen and used as projecting a false sense of guilt, right? So it's used where it's like some tragedy is orchestrated, being blamed on something else, on someone else, right? So there's a false sense of guilt projected on someone or something, and that's also a false flag, and that's how we typically use it today. So a false flag has both of those mirror images. We have false sense of innocence, allowing to gain access, but also a false sense of guilt, allowing to induce or seduce everyone into war, for instance. There are a lot of false flags done all over the world, frankly. The U.S. has committed false flags. The one I read here now, Operation Northwoods, actually wasn't, because John F. Kennedy rejected it. And so we all know what happened to JFK when you go against the shadow forces, right? So there's shadow forces, there's going against whatever that plan is. I don't think it's coincidence that, he's the one that they shoot in full display for everyone to see, a desecration of a sacred individual out in full display, right? And then they don't really have good answers for it. So, but when you see the kind of things that he rejected, you kind of understand why somebody within the government would do something like that, right? Because he's going against what their MO basically is. So in Operation Northwoods, the U.S. military devised a plan intended to provoke war with Havana and get rid of Soviet ally Fidel Castro. Plans were drafted in the 1960s to create chaos in U.S. cities, believing it would drum up public support for war against Cuba. Operation Northwoods included a plot to target an empty U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame it on Havana, sabotage ship in harbor. Sabotaging a ship in a harbor. Large fires, says a Pentagon memo. Sink ship near harbor entrance. Conduct funeral for mock victims. I've seen some things like that in some movie somewhere, I feel like, but I'm not sure. In March 1962, plans were reportedly presented to President John F. Kennedy's administration and rejected. So the fact that, to me, that plans would even be written, the fact that plans are, they've shown their card for anyone who's willing to listen. You're just willing to casually write up plans to target your own people. This is the Trojan horse. This is they use deception, obviously, to bolster their means to achieve some end. And it's no longer about what's right. It's about who's smart enough to deceive the other person, right? They get so caught up in their own ego, basically. And just like Lex, right? They're almost like children. It's like they get caught up in wielding this profane power, and all in the name of our comforts or the stability of some established order, right? So this is what it is, right? So both of these sequences, Chaos in Nairobi in BVS and Capitol Hill, are false flags, right? Orchestrated by Lex to project a false sense of guilt on Superman. A false flag and a false idol are related to each other, okay? In both cases, you get caught up in the fog and confusion of war, chaos, the cloud, the smoke, and you fixate on something false. That's idolatry. Fixation on a false thing, complacency with your fixation on the false thing is idolatry. And so as Lex orchestrates these false flags, he's orchestrating false idols, ultimately in the negative against Superman. Have the fake Kryptonite, a beautiful lie, the Trojan horse, a masterpiece of fraud. Right? Batman was drawn in by the Trojan horse, a bit like a little Red Riding Hood as well. The false exterior, the Trojan horse, the wolf in Granny's clothing, is actually his real friend who betrayed him. Right? Batman was caught off guard in his idolatry, transfixed by the glowing, the Kryptonite is fake. Right? So he's mesmerized by this glowing thing, but it's fake. It's a spiritual red herring. It's a Trojan horse. There's a deception cloaked in something innocent, right? So we see the deception or Trojan horse motif where the superficial layer is removed to reveal the destructive interior, the truth within. When Superman's soldiers, like Greek soldiers, reveal themselves and destroy and desecrate the sacred area, right? So again, we have a false friend, a false idol, Batman being mesmerized and carelessly steps into his own trap. Right? His own stumbling block due to his idolatry, and then the reality of it, the desecration of it, emerges. We have police idleness and Batman as false idol. So as we've talked about before, we see the idleness and idolatry coincide as the cops are transfixed by idle pursuits, making the football game a false idol. So remember, the football game in and of itself is not the idol, it's that they put it above the good and holy work of responding to what the radio operator describes as screams, right? So both cops choose idleness. Their carelessness is precisely the opportunity Batman needs to torture Santos, right? So maybe if they got there in time, he wouldn't have been tortured, and all of that would have been a little bit better, maybe, right? So, but through their carelessness, the Trojan horse, Batman, the idol, is brought into the temple and elevated above them. So through their idleness, they've allowed the idolatry of Batman to enter the sacred temple and be above them, right? And indeed, later we see when Clark investigates in Gotham, the cops have idolatrized Batman more directly in the comic strip, elevating him to a mythic level whereby he represents for them an excuse to not do the difficult and wholly proper work themselves, right? So they have this over-reliance on Batman, and it's kind of idolatrized in this comic visual. Right, so his light in the sky, his symbol is above them, and they're kind of complacent in that idolatry again. When Clark goes to see his earthly father at the top of the mountain, his father says,
"We saved the farm. Your grandma baked me cake. Said I was a hero. While I ate my hero cake, their horses were drowning."
Hero cake is therefore another such example of treating something as sacred in a grand idolatrous manner, which by nature hides the humbling and complex truth that everything affects everything else in unexpected ways, and we must always keep a careful eye toward the holy and humble divine work. And so earlier, when Clark goes to Lex's celebration of Friends of the Metropolis Library, right, we see that there is an egocentric red carpet pageantry with lots of cameras to make people feel good about their superficial accomplishments, complacent in their accomplishments, basically. One of the workers said, "You must be new to the let them eat cake beat," right? Suggesting, again, this idea of hero cake eating, self-satisfied Friends of the Metropolis Library, ignoring ugly truths, right? And so remember, through carelessness and complacency, idle celebration, the Trojan horse, the thing pretending to be sacred, is propped up and lauded. The false thing is, in effect, worshipped. The idol are blind, blithely unaware to the wicked thing lying within the superficial exterior, in this case, Lex's false persona. So they're applauding him, they're clapping, they're saying, "Lex, get up here, let's celebrate you, man." He's a devil in sheep's clothing, right? He's a wolf in sheep's clothing. And in their idleness, they don't really care. They're not really paying attention. You risk propping up idolatrous images. You risk celebrating false idols, figures that are actually hiding a wicked interior, a wicked truth, okay? So here we have Lois carelessly approach someone thinking she knows them, thinking that he's her friend, maybe, right? And in her blissful, careless ignorance and blind optimism, right? Like the Trojans, she steps into her own trap as Anatoly turns around and reveals his true nature. But by then it's too late, right? You've idolatrized something that lures you in. The idolatry is revealed to be hiding an ugly truth, and that is your downfall. And so the janitor and security guard outfits were but superficial layers, wolves in granny's clothing, hiding the wickedness within. Okay? Take the bucket of piss, call it granny's peach tea. It's analogous to take a weapon of assassination and call it deterrence, right? So in BVS, the weapon of assassination is the Kryptonite as a tool to kill or murder Superman, cloaked in a false notion of innocent deterrence. We're just trying to deter something in case something does happen. We don't actually have false motives or anything, right? So there's a cloaking of the true nature of the thing being connected to as directly analogous to a bucket of piss, granny's peach tea, right? Weapon of assassination, that's inside the Trojan horse. Weapon of assassination, cloaked in the hollow horse, the superficial layer of deterrence, innocent, holy, right? All of these things. And so in real life, right, the drone is often critiqued as a weapon of assassination. And here's one example from The Intercept, an article written a while back on drones, calling it not a drone program, because that kind of obscures its true nature. They call it the assassination program, right? Rightfully so. Sometimes also called targeted killing, because that's what it is, right? The drone program is often called the assassination program by its critics. Contrarily, proponents of drone use portrays drones as an overall innocent and precise tool for deterrence. In BVS, they're talking about the drone. They're alluding to the drone, right? So the drone has this element, and the drone in the story narrative is the Kryptonite, something that you're trying to pretend is something else, right? Bruce, when he speaks about it to Alfred, he tries to cloak his intentions, but his true intentions are something evil, something vile, and something gross, right? Something profane. And that is being juxtaposed to, therefore, or connected with drones and this double kind of narrative around it, where you have a superficial narrative like, oh, we're just being very innocent, it's very precise, we only do it when there's near certainty that no innocent civilians will be killed. But the truth is actually far uglier, far more nuanced, far more complex, and is more rightfully described as an assassination program, targeted killing. Again, it's a masterpiece of fraud as a tool that actually kills innocent men, women, children, and babies, often with a great civilian casualty rate exceeding 90%, sometimes reaching 100%. To buy into the official deception is to attribute false holiness to the powers that be. To be precise, to buy into any level of innocence that does not properly reflect the reality is idolatry, born out from an idle acquiescence to simplify our worldview and our responsibility in it by carelessly accepting official narratives and doctrines. The drone is therefore a Trojan horse, a false idol, wearing the cloak of holy precision and innocence of deterrence.
Go into greater detail. We see these beautiful pictures at night from the decks of these two U.S. Navy vessels in the Eastern Mediterranean. I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons. And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments making what is for them a brief flight over to this airfield. What did they hit? What are you convinced?
We can go straight to Key Red, Mr. President.
Not yet. Are you crazy?
They're high enough that we can nuke them with no casualties, sir.
One casualty, Mr. President. Superman.
God have mercy on us all. Fire at will.
3, 2, 1.
So we can sort of extend that idea in this idea that there's an idolatry of technological prowess in general, the intellect and the phallus, right? So the intellect is a masculine thing, the phallus is a masculine thing, technological prowess, that's all associated with masculine traits, okay? So Anatoly was a Trojan horse for General Amajog, posing as a friend, right? He is able to enter the sacred temple and destroy it from within, like the Trojan horse. Note he rides, again, on a horse on wheels, right? The horse on wheels reflects a technological prowess, right? So focus on the fact that it's a technologically advanced thing compared to, juxtaposed against, real horses. The more humble or more natural, more in tune with what's right. Python and his men attempt to desecrate the unholy image of the drone flying above them by showing a middle finger and by not following the CIA's orders. So the drone is another example of technological prowess as being falsely elevated, relied upon over and above the humble, good, and holy work. Further, we have, just like the horses on wheels with Anatoly and his men, we remember the wheelchair, right? Upgrade for Wallace. So there's a technological, flashy element to that. So there's an idolatry. We're seeing a pattern of idolatry related to technological ability, intellect, and the masculine over reliance on the masculine aspect. A symbol of a flashy and technologically advanced allure, which is actually a trap, right? He did not beware Greeks bearing gifts. He embraced the Trojan horse that led to his destruction. Further, in Bruce's preparation sequence, we see two aspects of masculinity juxtaposed. We see the mental faculties of the intellect on display as he uses technology to fashion the Kryptonite spear. Okay, itself an image of the masculine principle of the phallus, right? So notice he gazes upon it, suggesting an idolatrous projection of salvation through the rational and intellectual faculties of the masculine principle, forcing the world to make sense, right? So forcing the world to make sense, intellect, the phallus, the masculine, technological prowess, all these things are related to each other. Also, the other masculine principle presented here is physical prowess. So there's technological, there's the intellect, and then there's physical masculinity, which is also a different kind of idolatry, right? Thus, the lingering shots on his musculature, working out, lifting weights, an indication of the idolatry of the masculine form. Right? So it's all about idolatry of the overt masculine, both in intellect and in physical prowess, right? So that's what Batman is sort of like getting consumed by. And that, again, if that is idolatry, that is a trap. It's not the real thing. It's not actually going to save him. Another example we look at is burying an empty box, right? So one funeral at the end of the movie is a fantasy, a dream, a beautiful lie, a masterpiece of fraud, you might say. This continues the deception of the Trojan horse, the beautiful and magnificent, extravagant, mammoth, colossal thing hiding the emptiness within it, or the thing that leads to doom. The Trojans expected no one in the horse, and yet there was. The casket hides the fact that there's actually no one in it, and yet they treat it like there is a body in it, right? So it's an interesting play on the Trojan horse concept with a clear emphasis on the extravagant and showy nature of the imagined, captivating, transfixing idolatry. So Bruce says all those circuses, right? Circuses, that's a big, grand spectacle. Back east, burying an empty box, emphasizing the emptiness of the show and extravagance. The real funeral, right, actually has Clark's body. The real funeral has the people that actually knew the real Clark, that actually knew about his real journey, not the fantasy or idolatrous image of the man in the sky, the devil or Jesus character. They knew the man, the just a guy trying to do the right thing quality of Clark and Superman. So note that it is more humble, more simple, whereas the other one is a false flag, you might say, an over-the-top imitation, making up for the lack of a real body, the idolatry of technological and physical prowess. Okay, so there's a clear juxtaposition between going back and forth between this fantasy and this reality. We have the image of Superman as a monument, right? So he's elevated above us. This is a false idol. This is idolatrizing Superman in the infatuation kind of sense, right? Raising him up to be some God that's beyond all of us, right? And so what happens is that image gets desecrated, right? That's the humbling iconoclasm, the destroying of these icons that we want to revere and worship and put above us, leaving only the humble version of remembrance now. So he's not a God that's above all of us. He is a humble God, right? He's the humble good. He is just a guy trying to do the right thing, right? And so in place of that idolatrous version of Superman, there is a humble version. And how do we know this is what's right? Like what makes this right? It says, if you seek his monument, look around you. So it requires us to stand, right? If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything, right? So that's, if you don't stay on the holy path, you will fall for these graven images. You will fall for the deception. You'll fall for the illusion, okay? And so this now humble version of remembrance then necessitates that we stand, right? So each of us kind of being the flames of the holy work, the fire of the holy work. And that's the right way to do it, right? Because Superman is supposed to inspire people to do good, not have them be complacent in their established worldview, their established accomplishments, whatever it is. If you're creating a sense of complacency with their spiritual state and their lives and their world, that is not what Superman's about. Superman's about inspiring, right? That's the good. To inspire you to now be a vessel for truth and goodness, right? And so each of these people holding a candle now, that represents now we're not idolatrizing Superman. That's why he had to die. That's why he had to die, because it was just this sea of idolatry, okay? And so you had to tear down that idolatry. And that leaves us with only one option now, is to humble ourselves. That's a humbling iconoclasm. That's a destroying of false images, destroying of icons, destroying of idolatry. And so the last thing I want to do is summarize sort of where we're at. So I've gone through a lot of like sacred things, holy things, seeking the sacred, desecration, idolatry. Let's try to coagulate some of what we've learned in terms of how to perceive these films. In man's quest for salvation from suffering, or quest for communion with the divine, with beauty, he is always at risk of putting stake in the wrong thing. He is prone to idle distractions, projection, constructions, and embracing false idols, including false friends as well as false enemies. In this deception, he is prone to treating the unholy as if it were holy and the holy as if it were unholy. He is prone to an inversion of truth, prone to manifesting his own stumbling blocks, trapped by the deceptive glow and allure of extravagance of idolatry. The fake sacred, the false holy, the false idol, the golden calf, the Trojan horse, the forbidden fruit, the spiritual red herring, the spiritual MacGuffin are but snares along the path toward true salvation and communion with true beauty. The hero finally sees the truth. He removes the veil of idolatry, of vanity, of sin. He removes the illusion of worldly pleasures, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. Instead, he sees the boundless eternal spirit of love in each moment, a gift, the present of the present, the now that only appears to fade due to our idolatrous fixation on the allure and illusion of material stagnation.